Okay, this video is going to look at creating a composite between a photograph of a model and a photograph of a site model. So if you've been working with ideas, testing them out in 3D, making a model, as in this image of a site of a model here, photographed very carefully, black and white, and you want to put it in position to get a sense of what it would look like in the location you're planning to design it for. And you have a photograph of a site model, as in this photograph here. This is the site that is proposed to house this structure. So we're going to combine the two in Photoshop, and we're going to use the perspective warp tool to make that work well. A couple of things before we get going. Usually you have the opportunity to control the photography of one of these two objects. It may be that you can't take any new photographs of the site model and you're stuck with whatever you've got. We have a collection of photographs of the site models from this year's work available on Flickr if you want to hunt and find them down, track them down. And perhaps what you do have is control over the photography of the model that you are making now. Hopefully you do have control of that. What's great about this combination of these two particular things is this photograph of this model, this proposition here, is taken from the top. It's lit from the right hand side, so you can see a shadow here falling on the left, and there's a bit more light on the facade on the right hand side. And so we have one face, we have that one on the right, we have a face on the left, and we have the top. And that is going to work quite well in this scenario here, where you can see from the objects, buildings that are already modeled in this site model, we're looking at the top and two facades. So this model is proposed to go in this space here, and it will work well. The photography will work well, even though the angles aren't precisely matched yet. At least we have the elements to work with that will allow us to match that using the perspective warp tool. So the first thing to do, obviously open the files you're using, and these are just JPEGs opened in Photoshop. We're going to cut this one out, cut the model out, and put it into the other picture. Now what we're going to have to do is if you're going to spend some time working on this, is to save it as a Photoshop file. That will save all the cutting out information, the selections, all of the extra layers and things that you create by spending a lot of time cutting something out. And then you'll be able to return to that, modify it, use it again in something else. So first thing is to save this as a Photoshop file. You'll notice the title has changed now, got .psd next to it. And likewise for the other one, the actual image that we're going to work and use as the base, save that also as a Photoshop formatted file. And now they're both Photoshop. That's great. That will allow us to just keep saving things into that format, and we won't lose any of the information that we're going to create. Here we are, as you can see, if you look over at the layers palette, which I've got open here, and remember that palettes are accessed under Window in Photoshop. It's got a little padlock on there. We're going to unclick that and just call that base, and now we can work with that layer. It's unlocked. Okay, and we're going to zoom in here, and we can see what we've got to work with. And what's great about this particular model, it's mostly straight lines all the way around, so we can use a very straightforward tool for cutting things out. We're going to use the polygonal lasso tool to do that. It's over here in the toolbar. It's usually hidden under the more conventional looking lasso tool. You might have to go down and select it. Remember that tools in Photoshop with a little arrow pointing mean there's more than one tool hiding under that button. The polygonal lasso tool is an enclosed space with straight lines, and that's what it looks like. And so what you need to do is just very carefully begin clicking on the corners of things and following the straight lines. And here, as you've drawn all the way around, you just get close to the end here. You can see that the little circle appears next to the icon, and the next click completes the selection. So what you've got is a selection of the whole thing, enclosed like that. And obviously this model is ideal because it's got composed of straight lines. If you've got curves and things, then making the cutting things out is a little more tricky. You might need to use other tools to do that. If you need to remove things from the selection, then you can press the Option key and you get a little minus appearing next to the icon. And then as you draw, it will subtract from the selection you've made. And if you want to add things to it, just press the Shift and you get a little plus, and you can do that. So what we have is a selection of this object. Now what we can do here in Photoshop, the Photoshop version of this file, is we can save that selection. Okay. And we're going to call it something logical like model outline. And that means that we've now saved in this file this information that defines this cutout. It's actually called a channel. If you look over in layers, usually channels is one of the things next to layers. You can see that. You can see model outline is a shape. That is basically the cutout shape you've just made. What's great about that is if you accidentally get rid of this by deselecting it, oops, or you make a mistake when you're modifying it, perhaps, you can go back and load it again. And so you can go up to selection, load selection, and find model outline and go OK, and it's there, and you've got it back. Okay, so because it's a Photoshop formatted file, it's saving that information when you press save, like that. So that's part of this file, even though it's not visible all the time, so that's really, really useful. Okay, so having cut it all out, what we're going to do is move it into the other file. We can just copy that, so just Command C. We can go to the other file and just paste it in there. What will happen is it'll paste it in as a new layer, and we might gonna call that. And once again, change the name of the layer, the background, to logical. Okay, here we are. So now we're going to just save that folder, save that file, Photoshop as well. Okay, so what we've got here is our two elements in the same file, so we can start to work with them. And what we can see is obviously we're seeing the discrepancies in these things to begin with, but we'll get around to that and sorting that out eventually. Okay, so what we're going to do as the first task is we're going to try and match the perspectives a bit, so that the incoming model, the model of the design proposal, begins to match the perspectives in the site model. And we're going to use the perspective warp tool to do that. But first, we're going to put it more or less in the right position. It's going to be down here somewhere. It's actually designed to between this street and this walkway. I'm going to put it down there. So just putting it roughly in the right position will help us when it comes to working with the warp tool. Just zoom in again. It's harder to move the warp tool around. Well, you can move the object around using the warp tool, but it's a bit more cumbersome. Okay, so now we're ready to warp, and that's under Edit and Perspective Warp. Not Transform Perspective, not that one. Perspective Warp. Perspective Warp allows us to work with all three dimensions in the object. So it's a two-stage tool, so Perspective Warp. You'll get some instructions pop up when you use the tool for the first time. And you can see that you've got this rather complex icon on the end of the mouse on your cursor representing the tool. And it's got a set of crosshairs. And what we're going to do is just click around the corner of this object with the crosshairs, and we get a grid. Now the grid is the first part of the tool, the first part of the use of this tool is to look at the object that you want to distort and map the controls for the tool onto the object. So we're looking to analyze the perspective in the model that we're going to manipulate. And this grid represents one of the sides of this model. So we're going to position these points on the extremities of one of these sides here. Okay, so we're attempting to look at what we're bringing in and what we're going to distort, and matching the first one of these grids to one of the facades of this particular more or less cube-like building. So when we've done one of them, we can click the mouse again and we'll get another grid. And this grid will ask, this is now another side that we're going to be matching. What's great about this is you can actually quickly link the corners together. So we've got an edge here between the facade we've already matched. We want this to match the new one. When you get close like this, you'll get these lines highlighting. You just release that and it will snap to match, which is great, very handy. Now we're just heading out here at the corners. And we can still adjust these back. To refine this further. So now we've matched two of the facades, two sides of this cube, and we've got the option of doing a third one. So because we can see the top of this building, top of the model, we're going to click up here and we get a third one of these guys. So we can move this over here, come down this way. Speaking, so once again, if we move this close to here, we get the blue highlight, and if we move this down here, we get blue highlight. So we've clicked to those two to join that, and then we have a relatively straightforward job. You can see there's a bulge out in the design of this model here, so we can leave that where it is. We've pretty much matched up these three facades. Now we've got our cube, and I think we've finished the first part of using this tool. So at the top menu, you can see that we've been working in what's called the layout mode of this particular tool, perspective warp tool. So we've finished laying out our warp matte grid, and now we can move to the second part where we're actually going to distort this shape to match the perspective of the background image. So warp we move to now. We get some instructions about that, and you can see there's a simplification in the grid. The grid's gone, we just have the corner points now to manipulate. And what we can do now is move these around and look at the perspective in our background and try and match the two. So what we've got here is the edge of the pavement down this road, and that will give us some clues as to where perhaps this line, which is going to align with that, should be. Obviously we're going to get some distortions here as we move around. We're going to move that line first and try and line those things up more or less. And maybe this baseline here to be sitting in this corner, and then get these guys down a bit. So there's no science involved in this. I mean, we're not trying to match a grid in particular. We're just doing this by eye. We have to keep going until we just think it looks convincing. We're beginning to match optically what we perceive as the perspective in the background image. But I think that's not too far from where it should be. Obviously, whoever designed this model knows how high it is in relation to these other buildings, and so we'll have a better idea about what distortions should be. So maybe this is too tall otherwise, but I think we're happy with that. Okay, so if we're happy with the distortion, then we can just hit the tick button up here, and we've confirmed that distortion. We save the model, save the file, and what we've got now is our model matching the perspective roughly in the background. So what we're going to do is obviously do some tidying up here and add some elements to make this a little bit more convincing. So the first thing we're going to do is tidy up this background, which is full of visual noise from the studio. So we're going to get rid of the visual noise in the background by just selecting the areas of the image that we don't want to see and filling it with white. Okay, so we've made our selection of the image, the parts of the image that we want to simplify and get rid of. We're going to save that once again as well, and then save the file. Okay, so now we could actually, we can fill this area with white on the image underneath, or we could hedge our bets and create a new layer and just fill that with white. So edit fill, and then select white, and go 100%. Okay, deselect. So now we've got this as a separate layer. We can turn it on and off. If we wanted to use it independently, we could mix it through so we weren't totally obscuring every detail in the background if you wanted to, but I think it makes sense to completely get rid of it. One other thing we need to probably think about is kind of how we match the two elements together, or how we create a relationship between the background and the foreground that allows us to emphasize the insertion of the model into the image, but also see the relationship clearly between the two elements. One way to do it, I think, is to make this the background model photograph monochromatic, so black and white. So we select the layer of the background, go to image adjustments here, and then we're just going to go to desaturate, and that will get rid of all the color there. Okay, so now we have two monochromatic elements together. We have the model image, which is slightly higher contrast than the background, but they're both black and white, and so they're beginning to have a more of a close relationship together visually. Okay, so one other thing we can do to integrate more convincingly the model into the site is to create the shadow that this model might project onto the forms that are in the site model. And we're guessing here. We're just going to work on that. And what I'm going to do is create a new layer for that. I'm going to put it underneath the model layer over here in the palettes. And then I'm going to draw a selection by hand that will be pretending to be a shadow cast by this model onto these objects in the background. And you just have to take your best guess as to what this might look like. Okay, so I'm going to suggest that the model might be casting a shadow in this direction. So from the right, because you can see if you look at the right facade of the model, the light's falling on that side. So that's, we're going to say the sun is on that side, if you like, and the shadow is being cast in this direction. And it's going to come in this way, so along here. Perhaps it's going to meet this wall. It's going to go up this wall a bit. Now obviously the shapes of these things would be cut here, so perhaps there's a bit of a notch coming out of this shadow caused by the notch in the model design. Maybe the shadow falls this far up this wall, and then maybe it doesn't fall as far on the ground behind the little wall. So I'm just going to give it a go there and see what I think. So I'm not being too precise when I'm behind the model here, because I know that my shadow is going to be behind. The model will sit on top of this layer, the shadow in it. Having made it, okay, I'm just going to go, I'm going to fill that, edit fill with the black. And then I can play around with that. Okay, but obviously what I can do is I can change the opacity of that layer straight away, and the shadow can be 45% or lower. And you begin to get a sense of what it might be like. I'm still not entirely happy with what's happening down the bottom here. Maybe I need sorting out a bit in future, but you can see that it's beginning to look a little bit more like it belongs, and it's actually in this photograph. One other thing I could do, I think, is I could lessen the intensity of the background site model, once again to emphasize the foreground model. So with the site model, obviously I could treat the photograph in some way, but what I'm going to do actually is create yet another layer. I'm going to put it underneath the site model layer, and I'm going to fill it with white. Okay, and then I'm going to go to the site model layer and then change its opacity. So basically it's going to become slightly translucent and reveal white underneath, so white will come through, and it will just take the prominence of that layer back down a little bit. And so this the site volumes become a little bit less prominent, and we emphasize the model in the foreground. Okay, so that's using Perspective Warp tool to take a photograph of a model design and integrate it into a photograph of a site model. That's it. Bye.